Hello, this is Gary Flisspart. I distribute the GLFPE, the GLF Programming Environment Live Boot Linux remix distribution of Debian 9 for with a suite of applications and libraries that allow me to do a lot of everyday work, including programming and some technical work, some video work. What I'm going to demonstrate is how to bootstrap from the official Debian release to the GLFPE as an alternative to downloading my ISOs and putting them on USB or DVD. Downloading mine is easier, but if you want to do it yourself and perhaps put additional or fewer, if you choose, applications on the disk or alternative ones, you can download my configuration file and then edit it as you need and produce a newer version of the GLFPE that has the good parts that I put in and maybe some things that you want to put in. At any event, the beauty of this system is that not only can I build these things and maintain them, but so can you. You can download the configuration, then use that configuration as a basis to make more in the future. You don't need to download my configuration if you can build your own from scratch, but you'll get a head start if you use mine. Okay, I'm back. Located the proper drive. I'm going to plug this drive into an available spot. Bear with me, I've just lost my mouse because I had to plug it into an available slot. This is what's on this disk. And I have a few programs on here, a few configuration file sets which are archived. What I'm looking for is this one here. This is the GLFPE 512 compressed file. I'll copy it over to this drive because I'll need it. You'll find this particular configuration file or a newer version of it on the site I point to. The site's not a full-fledged website yet. It's just a Google Drive site that I'm pointing to. But the files are there. Now there's one more file I want to copy over here. It says Linux scripts. I'll copy that over here because we'll need some tricky scripts to get this job to work right. Okay, now I've brought that down. I'm now going to remove the drive that had the data on it. Safely remove drive. I can now remove that drive. Having done that, I can plug my mouse back in. And I have my mouse back. Okay, now, if I right-click, I get a context menu, open within Archive Manager. This is one way to do it. I do that. I do a Control-A, select everything, and then drag them over. That's one way to unpack files. Another way, go to this one here, the big one, and it says extract here. That's what I want to do, so that's what I will do. It takes a little while because it's about 300 megabytes compressed pretty highly in some places. here. Now that it's finished unpacking it, and I have this folder, GLFPE 512_I386. This is the configuration file set. In this folder, I have configuration files, and this is also the place where it will build the live build ISO. The configuration files are contained under the config directory. There are a variety of things in here. There are some folders here that are basic parameters that get set, and there are two files in here which I frequently change because I have a version number in these names here. This is the ISO volume name, and I change that number. I'm not going to bother to at this point because I want to show you that it works with what I've given you. So it'll produce the same effect, same name when I'm done. This here, the build file, has another place where I've put that number. One note, the configuration version here, you'll find this is tied to Debian 9. I have some older versions for Debian 8, the Jesse release, that are still available. I don't use them anymore because I've pretty much moved to Debian 9. The Debian 8 used a slightly different version of the configuration of the live build system, and it's different. You don't use the same configuration files. I have some configuration files for Jesse. If you want to experiment with that, use those configuration files. Don't use this set. In any event, there are a variety of things in here that matter. Under packages.chroot, I have some Debian, some .deb files, which are Debian-based packages ready to be installed that aren't, or perhaps they're unavailable in the standard repositories, perhaps they are different versions. I've got a couple of cases in here where I've repackaged a version that works differently than the version that's provided in the other package. So I install it separately. The package lists, there's a list, there's a ASCII file that has a list of the packages to install. This is where I do the bulk of the installations. These names are the names of packages that get installed when it comes in, and there are quite a few of them in here that are different. The base installation for Debian actually is right up here, TaskMate Desktop, Print Server, and a couple of other things in here. There'll be very few names in this in the base distribution. I've added a whole lot of other things in here, including things like printer drivers, a whole bunch of libraries for programming purposes that match my needs for the programming source code that I have. There are a bunch of applications in here I found particularly useful that I've installed in here, and I can show those off later. In any event, that's where the bulk of the configuration gets done in there. We'll leave this alone for now, but you're free, if you do this yourself, you're free to edit these to your heart's content and change the way it works. There are some other places in here where I do some special things. I've got some special file folders with special content that gets inserted. Now this is to fix certain problems that I've had, that these are effectively patches to the file system. The default content of these directories would be something else, and by putting things in here I've solved certain problems. This is some of the value you get out of using my configuration. In any event, one key thing I've got in here is I have a folder that I specifically put into a specific place that's visible during the process of building, where I can build my own stuff from source code and put it into place. So it's important that this content be there. It's part of the process, the build process, but this is entirely custom. This is something I put together. If you were to build up from the default thing, you would either do that yourself or not have it at all. Another place, the hooks, there are some scripts that get run in the process of running that tie some of this together. This is a script that gets run. This includes things to compile certain programs on the fly while it's building things and put them into the right places. This includes things like a special version of the Arduino IDE, and it is an important part of the process. In any event, this is a quick tour of the configuration files. In a little bit here, we're going to actually start a process in which we try to build a new version of a live boot Linux image from scratch on the fly. It's a process that takes a couple or 3 or 4 hours. It really depends on how fast your internet is, how fast your computer is, but this takes anywhere from 2 to 4 hours depending, and we'll do that. I'll start demonstrating that shortly. Okay, I'm back. I'm ready to start the process. Bring back this drive. This is the drive we've put together that has a configuration file set on it. It has the scripts on it that I was talking about before. I have multiples of this, but we'll demonstrate with this one. This one is for 386. You have to use a version that's compatible with the system you're running. I'm running a 386 version of the operating system. I have to use that if I'm going to configure and upgrade the 386. So that's the one I'm using. Okay. The first thing I have to do, this is where the script comes in and some of these other applications that are available. We need to know that we need to remount this drive. The default way that Debian Linux mounts this drive under the file manager will not work for the live build process. There are a couple of tricky little things that have to be changed in the mount, and I do that with this script. Now what I do is I will reformat, I will remount the drive so that it shows up under the user folder as a different name by running this script. But I need to know one little piece of information, and I can get that very easily by going to the system monitor. Not the system monitor, I'm sorry, the system tools terminal. And then I'll type in sudo, S-U-D-O, space fdisk. You gotta be careful with this, you don't want to do it wrong. -L. This will just list all the drives in detail. And what I'm looking for is to make sure this is probably the last one. And it looks like the last one, SDC1, is the correct one. That's a little information for my benefit that I wanted to see. Now, I need to execute the shell script remount for LB. There's more than one way of doing this. One of the things I'm going to do is to show you how to get this for how you to make this work in a reliable way. What I will do is I'll copy this shell script over to the user folder. Drag and drop will work. The thing is set to executable, so I should be able to make it work. Now, the user folder is the default for starting up with the terminal. If I do an ls command, which is equivalent to dir in Windows, the list, it shows me the file name, and it shows this remount for lb.sh. Now I'm going to run that file, but I have to give it the name of that disk. So I'm going to do /remount for lb.sh space, and then I've got to type in the device name, which is /dev/sdc1 from what I saw before on the list. I do that. If it's successful, that will bump out of the way and remount, and now I have a folder, live build, over here under user. Double click on that, and I have the same content you saw before. I don't need this terminal anymore. The reason I did that was because this little remount shell script puts a couple of tricky little parameters on there that are important to getting this to work. Now that it can work, I'm going to use another trick in that I installed, before I specified to install 4 applications, two of which were add-ons to the file manager that I said would be useful later. Well, here's where they become useful. If I click right on this folder, and there's an item down here in the menu that wouldn't have been there had I not added it, open in terminal. I click on that. I now have opened in that terminal. I've basically changed to that directory and gone into a terminal in that place. It's not critical. You could do it some other way, but that's handy. And then, now that I've done that, I'm about to start the actual process. Very easy to start, assuming your configuration is properly set up. If it's not, you'll have trouble later, but assuming it's set up properly, I can type a sudo space lb space build, B-U-I-L-D. Sudo lb for live build, sudo lb build. That's a command that will set the thing up to do the entire process unattended for the next couple or 3 hours. I'll start it. It does require that you make sure before you start this that you've got a live internet connection that's working, preferably wired, and necessarily fast enough that it won't slow this down. In any event, if it's too slow, it could actually cause it to break. But assuming it's fast enough, you start it, and it will start doing a bunch of things. I'm not going to try to show you everything it does. I may take a few snapshots along the way that show parts of the process. But for the most part, I'm going to pause the video and come back later as things are accomplished. But what this process will do is it will create some subdirectories under the configuration folder. It will essentially create a little simulated Linux environment that contains everything that the original had or needed to be able to do this job, and in effect reproduce the GLFPE, the GLF Programming Environment for Linux, as I wish it to be inside that folder, then create an ISO file to make an image to reproduce that, and be able to boot it outside of that environment. It'll do all that over the next couple of hours. As I said, I'll snapshot a few parts of the process as they come up, but in the meantime, see you later. Back to report some intermediate progress. First thing that the build does, create the directories, and then after that it starts working through the package lists and building up the list of things it needs to do. Then it goes through a process of getting those packages. A good piece of the time it takes to do it is to get the packages and install them. What you see happening right at the moment are a bunch of wget operations that are bringing in files from the internet and building up lists. The reason you need so much space on the drive for the work drive is that you put a whole lot of files on it and build a lot of things that would ordinarily be installed to a hard drive, and they take a considerable amount of space. After downloading the packages, it spends a considerable amount of time unpacking the packages. Later on, it will install them. Each time I've had to show the intermediate progress, I've had to deal with this, so I thought I'd show it at least once. By default, Debian powers down the screen after a few minutes, and when you bring it back up, you have to type in a password. The default user is user, and the default password is live. L-I-V-E. Brings it back up. It's in the process of doing installs at this point. You see things like number of packages, upgraded number of packages. It's apparently moved past the initial installs from the package lists, and it's moved into the hook script that compiles programs that I've specifically put together, and that bodes well because it means all of the basic stuff in the repositories went through cleanly. Now it's doing things like compiling the Wix widgets library from source. It's compiled the VIDE development environment from source. It'll be moving on and installing Arduino short. Okay, it's gotten through the compilations of Wix widgets and Allegro libraries. It's copying the files from the latest version of the Arduino IDE downloaded from the website. That's not installed from source, it's installed from binaries, but they're newer than what's in the repository, so I had to run them through an intermediary machine and repackage them. At any event, this is most of the way through the hook scripts. Okay, it's gotten far enough through the process now. It's finished the hook scripts. It's now actually building the initial kernel image that will be used to boot the system, which means that it's got everything it needs to do that so far. All the kernel libraries have been put together, and it knows what's in it. There are a number of esoteric install processes that happen in that, and then it will shortly move into the process of building the SquashFS file system. Squashed file system is basically it's a read-only compressed version of a working file system, and it's part of the live build distribution. It's in pretty much all of them. It allows you to pack a very large several gigabytes into about 1.5 gigabytes or so. It can be read on the fly by the Linux utilities, so it looks like a regular file system to Linux. That process takes a while. When it's doing the file SquashFS compression, it doesn't really need connection to the internet at that point because it's done downloading for a while, and it's basically crunching on the computer. Now this is where a fast computer pays off, because if you have multiple cores, multiple threads running, it will run considerably faster. It's not quite to the SquashFS yet, but it'll be there soon. Okay, it's finished with all the building of the chroot files, so it was able to start compressing the FileSquashFS file system. You're not going to see any change on the screen for quite a while. This takes a long time. It says it's parallel using 2 processors. That's better than 1 processor, but it's going to take a while. I've got another machine in which I could do it with 4 threads going at the same time. The nature of the live build process is a little fragile in that if there's anything at all wrong with configuration, it's probably going to just die. It will stop somewhere in the middle, and there may be ways of restarting from certain key places, but for the most part, the best thing to do is to just start over, fix the problem, and move on. And sometimes the problem is as simple as a temporary hiccup on the internet. If you have a problem with the internet going down briefly, it may be just at the wrong time when it's trying to download something, and the fact that it can't download something it wants to will kill the process. But usually if it dies before this point. Essentially, if you get to the point where it's creating the FileSquashFS, chances are everything's going to be fine. Unless you introduce a new bug somewhere into the configuration that shows up later, everything that matters to build the live build Linux has already been done, except for building this compressed file system. So it takes a while, but when it's done, it will probably move smoothly into the finish in a few minutes afterwards. It doesn't take that long to finish up after it's done creating the FileSquashFS. The longest thing that happens after that is creating the ISO file itself, which, at least in terms of a single operation, which is actually rather quick, certainly a whole lot quicker than making the FileSquashFS. Okay, I came back because I noticed that it actually got through the process and created the ISO file. The Reso program wrote the ISO file, so it's very close to being finished now. So I'll continue the tutorial. It'll only take a couple of minutes for this final stuff to happen. There's basically, it's uninstalling some of the stuff that it put locally onto the machine to deal with making the build. But the ISO file should be built by now. And it's Reso completed successfully. There is an ISO file. Back again, it's about to finish. It just finished. We're back to the command line prompt again. So it's finished the job. Okay, what I'm going to do is now go inside this folder and look at things. And what you'll find is a bunch of files. Go to the icon form. This one in particular is the ISO file of interest, which is 2.5 gigabytes in size. That's what I expected. Now, back to the icon view again. One of the features of the way this works is it has to work in root mode to do that, and it leaves behind a bunch of files that are owned by root. Even though this is the user's home directory, there are files owned by root inside here, and that can be problematic, particularly if you're copying things around. So this is where one of the features I installed optionally before as an extension to Caja comes into play. If I right-click on this folder, I have a menu item that says Open as Administrator. If I do that, then I will open the same folder, but now it has full permissions to look at and deal with these files. Whereas before, some of the files were locked for certain operations from the normal user. If I bring up right-click and click Properties on this file and look at permissions, I'll see it's owned by root. But I can change that if I have root access, as I do under this prompt. I can change that to user and also change the group to user. Close, and there, voila, our file is now owned by the user. Now the simplest way for me to get that file away from everything else, open a new window to, again as super user, to the main user directory, and I can copy this. I can not copy it, I can move it over back there. Now I have a regular user file in a regular user folder, and I really don't need this stuff anymore unless there was something wrong and I wanted to diagnose it and look at what made it, what didn't. I could go look as super user. I can go under here and I'll see the entire file system that was built under the chroot, and I could use that information to let me know what messed up. But on the assumption that nothing actually messed up this time, I'm just going to close this window out. This is still in the super user mode here. And what I can do now is just delete it. Now this is taking up a rather large amount of space. I went from a 32 gig disk drive down to a 13.5 gig available remaining. So we'll see what effect it has to delete this. I'll do a shift delete on this and delete the entire folder, since just make sure that I've actually copied the ISO out. As you've seen by this process, the only two things I need to reproduce this work are this configuration file and the live build system, so that I'll produce the ISO again. I'll delete this because I really don't need all that space that's taken up. I really don't need it to be taken up. So that deletes a large amount of files. Total of about 12.5 gigabytes worth of files. So now deleting them. Now, since I've deleted it, I no longer need to be root, so usually you get out of, don't stay root any longer than you have to. You'll end up causing yourself some trouble or leaving yourself open to security problems. So, now that I'm back to a regular user under the user directory, I can look at this file by double-clicking on it, and it opens up in the archiver. You can see what's in it, and this has the GLFPE content in it, including the splash screen graphic that tells you what version, date, and number it is, 5/12, January 1st, 2018. So this is a replication, more or less, of the last update ISO that I put out on the website as of this date. It may be slightly different than the one that I put out because every time you run the live build, it takes the latest available packages. Any security updates, any kernel updates, any application updates. So the beauty of a live boot system is that nothing changes between uses because it goes by Vegas rules. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. If you do anything during the session, it's in RAM only, so it goes away when you reboot. The beauty is that it stays the same. The problem is it stays the same. Eventually, you're going to have to upgrade the system to deal with security patches and stuff like that. You should reasonably frequently, like once a month or so, apply this kind of upgrade process that I just demonstrated in these videos to generate the next version of an ISO file and burn it to a DVD or USB. The great thing about this system is that I can bootstrap it. I can start with one version and build the next. Since I've demonstrated that you can use this system to create the next version of the GLFPE upgraded with all the applications, starting from the official Debian distribution, it's inferred by that, and certainly proven in practice, you can then use the next version of the GLFPE, whatever you have in think to make the next version of the GLFPE. So it bootstraps. You start from minimal resources, bring up more and more complicated things until you end up moving to the higher level. It climbs the ladder. The great thing about the way I've worked this process out now is that I did the entire thing using only external external drives. I used USB sticks that are available everywhere and cheap, and a computer, which is the universal component you always need to do this sort of work. I started with Windows, moved to Linux, and then did everything else in Linux from then on out. You no longer have to go back to Windows. You can use Windows to, say, the universal USB creator. You can use it again if you wish, but you don't need to. I'll demonstrate at least one of the methods next. You can create either a USB drive from this ISO or a DVD. I have another video to demonstrate creating a USB, a bootable USB. So what I'll do next is to demonstrate how to use the facilities within the GLFPE for Linux, or any Debian distribution Linux, really, Debian Mate at least. I'll use the built-in DVD burner to burn this ISO to a DVD, and then we'll show that it works.